Gary Stearman sitting in for J.R. Church. Today's Prophecy in the News update, and our guest, once again, is Bill Federer. William J. Federer, author, lecturer, a widely known speaker, and his heart is in freedom and in liberty and documenting the history of same in the United States of America. Bill Federer, welcome to Prophecy in the News once again.
Gary, great to be with you.
And let's go ahead and talk about your book. This book, which we have discussed on a previous update, is called Endangered Speeches. There's a sense in the air today that the battle is engaged, and the battle being how free are we going to be after the smoke clears?
Well, you know, there are reports of several million being in Washington, D.C. on the 9/12 Project events and the Boston Tea Parties that we've been reading about all over the country. Mm-hmm. People are upset, and they're concerned about the government taking a larger and larger role controlling their lives. And you know, one of the things I talk about is when America was formed. In Europe, they had this idea that the king held all the power. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, for most of world history, kings held the power. You know, there's only been 6,000 years of recorded human history. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds like a lot, but really that's not very long. That's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back, and you're all the way back to the very beginning of recorded human history. Now, when I say recorded human history, this is humans writing history. You get any world civilization textbook, and it starts at 3,000 or 4,000 B.C. Mm-hmm. with Egyptian hieroglyphics and Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets. And so, you know, evolution tries to say man's been around for millions and millions of years, but as far as the actual record goes, it's only been about 5,000 or 6,000 years. And during that 6,000 years, empires have risen and empires have fallen. Mm-hmm. Empires have risen and empires have fallen. I mean, we have America today, and we think, oh, America's the greatest, it must have been always this way. No, it hasn't. You had the Egyptian Empire. You had the Babylonian Empire. You had the Persian Empire. Right. You had Alexander the Great's empire. You had the Roman Empire. Then you had Attila the Hun wiped out, you know, the Roman Empire. Then you had the Frankish Empire, you know, with Charlemagne. You had the Byzantine Empire. Then you had the Muslim Umayyad Empire. Within 100 years of Muhammad's death, Muslims conquered from the tents of Arabia to Paris. And then you had the Vikings. For about 200 years, the Vikings, with their small boats, went up the rivers and killed the men, take the women, and throw them over their shoulder. And many of the Christian women got their heathen husbands saved. And then the Vikings, you know, the Swedes and Danes became Christian. And then you had the Spanish Empire, where the sun never set on the Spanish Empire. Mm-hmm. Where they had, you know, claims to all of Americas, and they had the Philippines and so forth. And then the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch, and then they had the British Empire, where they said the sun never set on the British Empire, where they had, you know, the colonies in America, Jamaica, Canada, the British Guyana. They had the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, and India, and Hong Kong. But something happened. During that time, power was always concentrated in the hands of a few. Pharaohs, monarchs, sultans, despots, Caesars. And they just swapped out one for the other. And the people didn't have the power. Well, in America, we did something different. We had an experiment. Because of the 3,000-mile ocean between us and our monarch, the King of England, we got a chance to experiment with self-government. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, we made the people the king and the politicians the servants. They're public servants. You hire them, you fire them. And so what happened is we went from the concentrated powers of the monarch to the separated powers of our Constitution, but after every crisis, we see a gradual reconcentration of power. Mm. In other words, it was good that Lincoln ended slavery, but in the process, he concentrated power in the federal government.
Now, in your book, you talk about the fact that churches used to be deeply involved in political affairs. And over time, there has come to be this quote-unquote separation of church and state. You asked the question, which I'm looking at right here. It's printed on the back cover of your book. Why are churches afraid to speak on public issues? And, you know, we ought to ask ourselves that question. Why are we afraid?
Well, again, churches used to be able to speak on anything. Prior to 1913, there was no IRS. Once the IRS was created, they created a tax category for the churches. But guess what? Everybody wanted to jump into that category because they didn't want to be taxed. So you had the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, but then you had a bunch of these communist organizations that jumped into it. And the government didn't like that. And so they began to limit what 501c3s could do. And then you have all these other groups, like the ACLU is a 501c3, mm-hmm. Planned Parenthood is a 501c3, even Playboy is a 501c3. They're all jumping into this category, and government begins to limit that category. But a big change happened with Lyndon Johnson. He was being targeted by an anti-communist 501c3 organization, pointing out his Great Society socialist programs, and he didn't like that, so he pushed through the Senate a change in the tax code to prohibit churches, 501c3s from endorsing candidates.
Wow, just have to interrupt you there. Did you hear what he said? A change in the tax codes. Those things are insidious.
Oh, I mean, the president's changing the tax code today. Tax codes can be changed. I got a degree in accounting. We used to have a shelf full of binders, and you'd get new changes every year before the days of the internet. I mean, it was a big deal. And so pastors couldn't keep up with the tax code. And so even in 1960, W.A. Criswell, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, had a radio broadcast Sunday sermon on why John F. Kennedy should not be president. Did he get in trouble for it? No. The only response was Kennedy goes down to Texas, meets with all the Baptist ministers in Houston, promises them that he won't let the Pope tell him how to run America, and they all vote for him.
Wow.
So pastors used to always endorse candidates. But in the late 1960s is when the ACLU, which is a 501c3 organization, just like churches are, and ACLU was started by a communist, Roger Baldwin, who said, I'm for communism. The ACLU began to intimidate churches. And so pastors backed away from being the conscience of the country. They began to speak less and less on social issues, and now that a generation has gone by, they assume they never did. And this was one of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. got upset at, because he was a Baptist minister in Atlanta, and he said in his Birmingham jail speech, he says, I'm between two segments of the black community. One has been beaten down so much that they have given up. The other is tending to violence. And they are advocating that the white man is the incorrigible devil, and they want to destroy America. And this is exemplified in Elijah Muhammad's black Muslim movement and the black nationalist movements, who say that they want the white man's the devil. Anyway, Martin Luther King Jr. said, I'm standing between this, trying to lift up this person, but trying to keep us from going into this radical, Jeremiah Wright direction. Yes. And he said, he says that the gospel is the correct way. And so his movement was a nonviolent movement. And anyway, but he was criticizing the white church for being so much wanting to follow the IRS rules and not to speak out against racial injustice. And that was a situation where pastors were speaking out less and less and less, that Martin Luther King Jr. Said the church is supposed to be the conscience of the state. Wow.
And here on page 213 in your book, and by the way, the name of the book, Endangered Speeches, if you're interested, the ACLU states on its website, quote, the power even of a Democratic majority must be limited to ensure individual rights, end quote. What a statement.
It sounds good at first, but then you realize, what are the implications of that? If the power of the majority is limited, what do you have in its place? The power of a minority. And when Lincoln, at the Gettysburg Address, said that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, published in the USA Today, said that 77% of Americans are Christian. 52% Protestant, around 25% Catholic, 2% Eastern Orthodox or other. 77% of Americans are Christian. There's a 0.5% Hindu, 0.5% Buddhist, 0.6% Muslim, which is sort of interesting, because here you have the president give a speech in Europe and say we're not a Christian nation, even though 77% say they are. But 0.6% are Muslim, and he says, we're one of the largest Muslim countries in America. He's like, what numbers are he looking at? 1% of Americans identify themselves as atheists, 2% Jewish, and 2% Mormon. And so anyway, we see that we have a minority, the 1% atheist, trying to force its will on the majority, the 77% Christian, and we see that we're no longer a government that represents the will of the people, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
I hate to cut you short. We are on a roll. Of course, when you're talking to Bill Federer, you're always on a roll. The man is a veritable fountainhead of wisdom, particularly on the subject of freedom and liberty in speech. Endangered Speeches. The subtitle, How the ACLU, IRS, and LBJ Threaten Extinction of Free Speech, loaded with all kinds of interesting information. Bill, thanks for coming by again today. And this has been another Prophecy in the News update.